Yeah. Hello, Bio30. Welcome back. Today we are going to be looking at the respiratory system, which is our next topic. It flows in really well with the circulatory system. We talked about in the circulatory system a systematic and a pulmonary circuit. And we focused a lot on the systematic circuit that's going between the blood and the rest of your body. We kind of just glazed over the pulmonary circuit, which covers the blood and your lungs. That's because this relates directly to the respiratory system, which is what we're going to be looking at today over the next couple of sessions. Respiratory itself, it's designed to carry oxygen into our cells so that we can undergo cellular respiration. Pardon me as I move my camera around here a little bit. In doing so, we're going to be releasing some energy that's coming from glucose and that whole cellular respiration process, opening up those ATP bonds. And one of our waste products is going to be carbon dioxide, which we're going to be using in our body later on. We're going to learn about that, though, much later on, though, when we talk about the system. Now, with the respiratory system, our goal is to bring oxygen, that's from an external environment, from an atmospheric environment, as a gas into our body where we have lots of liquids and fluids, like our blood, which is a liquid. We're trying to get that gas into that blood somehow. That is a function of this respiratory system. Respiration is what we're going to be using to describe what this whole process is. So the breathing in, the breathing out, how that necessarily affects the inside of your body, that's all going to be coming from our respiratory system. So there's a couple of organs that are brought in together. They're going to bring oxygen in, carbon dioxide out, and there's a couple of ways we're going to do that. What you probably already understand is breathing. This is when you inhale or you exhale, or other words we can use are inspiration and expiration. After breathing, though, we can analyze specific components of our breathing. External respiration, for example, is that connection between our lungs, so our internal environment, and our external environment, the air, the atmosphere around us. So, how does the gas exchange in our lungs into our blood from the outside external environment to the inside environment? Then we can look at our internal respiration, which is that connection between our blood and our body cells. So, fully inside of your body, hence internal respiration. The last form is something we talked about in our very first topic with wellness was cellular respiration. And this is how your cells are going to be producing that energy. They're not creating it, but they're accessing it from those ATP bonds. And that oxygen is a part of that cellular respiration equation that is so useful to us. This is typically happening in the mitochondria of our cells. A couple of stages of that respiration. We talked about breathing, which is how air enters and leaves your body, external between your lungs and your blood, and then internal, which is your blood and your body. We need a couple of things for respiration to actually happen. There's two requirements. One of them is we need that surface area. We talked about that with the digestive system. When food gets into your small intestines, the more surface area you have through the villi and the microvilli, the more absorption you're going to have. The same thing kind of happens in your lungs, where the more surface area you have, the more gas exchange is possible. So that's useful for us. It's useful for our body's needs. But on top of that, in order to get our gases to dissolve, we need some moisture in the environment. So the entire respiratory tract must be moist. If that moisture isn't there, we're unable to dissolve that gas into liquid as easily. It's a bit of a chemistry topic, so we're not going to get into the chemistry of it so much in this course. You'll have to trust me on it for now that a moist environment is much more beneficial for dissolution of a gas into a liquid. A couple of other organisms do something similar, but they cannot, they don't have such a sophisticated system. So they live in an environment which is already wet. And I'm talking about our aquatic friends. They don't need to worry about getting that oxygen into a liquid form because it's already in a liquid form for them. Their environment is water. But for us, we're a little bit more advanced. That's why we're terrestrial. So we need to get that gas into our cells somehow. Now, this whole process of how we get things across one of these membranes, whatever medium you're talking about, whether it's water or air, this is called ventilation. For us as humans and for a lot of organisms on land, it's going to be ventilation through air over a surface, but that's also possible for, say, water over a surface. And potentially there is room for that in other mediums as well. Maybe some that haven't been discovered, or there's some that I don't know of personally. So there's different kinds of ventilation that can be possible. And when we talk about the respiratory system, typically we're talking about lungs, which are the main component of our respiratory system. You all know where the lungs are inside of your chest. Inside of your lungs, we got this lining, these little sacs called an epithelium. That's going to keep the lungs kind of moist, almost wet feeling. That's going to also increase the surface area. So there's a lot of these bumps and grooves inside of our lungs that allows for this to happen. And the best thing about respiration is that it's free. It happens through diffusion. Diffusion is where things move from a high concentration to a low concentration across a membrane. Well, this is what's happening inside with gas exchange. It's going to happen for free, no energy required to move from a high concentration to low concentration. A little asterisk there, though, because we are going to spend the energy somewhere else to make this a more efficient process. But theoretically, we don't even need those other components because we're just dealing with the physics of the situation now, where things are moving from high concentration to low concentrations. As organisms on land, we need to breathe, and you might notice you don't really think about it so much. Even when you're asleep and you're kind of unconscious, you're still breathing because the first thing that we employ is our brain. Our brain's going to monitor, make sure that we are breathing, it's going to keep us breathing so that we don't have to focus on that. Our body's always going to function to breathe, which pretty useful. On top of that, your brain's going to connect to one muscle called the diaphragm right at the bottom of your thoracic cavity. It's at the very top of your abdominal cavity. In fact, your diaphragm is what separates the two cavities, your upper and lower cavity, in the front part of your body. This diaphragm is a muscle that's going to flex and manipulate the different pressures that you have in your chest versus your external environment. And that's what's going to help us breathe. So when we breathe, we're not actually just sucking air in or blowing it out. What's actually happening is we're either flexing that diaphragm. When we flex it, that's the image on the right that I'm kind of covering here. When we flex that diaphragm, it pulls downwards and it creates a low pressure system inside of our lungs. Because the low pressure, it's lower than the atmosphere, which is outside, and the atmosphere's pressure is higher, so it moves down the concentration gradient and the air flows into our lungs. So when you breathe, you're not actively sucking that air in necessarily. What you're doing is you're flexing that diaphragm so that the air moves into your lungs. And the opposite is true when you relax your diaphragm, it's moving back up into position. So that's this first diagram here. It's moving back up into position, which adds a bit of pressure into your lungs. And that pressure is going to push the air out. So you're not physically blowing the air out. What's happening is the air is moving out because you've relaxed that diaphragm. We often say that for healthy people, it's a good idea to practice holding your breath from time to time, not all at once because that could cause you to pass out, but it's because you're flexing and holding that diaphragm, you're making it a little bit stronger. So it doesn't get as sore as easily. It doesn't worry about having to work hard when you're not prepared for it. And that brings us to breathing. So exhalation at the bottom here, you can see that this diaphragm is kind of hidden in the back here, but it points upwards. That puts a high pressure system inside of your chest cavity. High pressure, low pressure outside. So things move from high to low. Everything comes out. Whereas if we're talking about breathing in, now we have that diaphragm pulling down, which is going to decrease that pressure. You're increasing the volume, so decreasing the pressure. So air is going to flow into your body, and your rib cage will move outwards to accommodate that excess air that's coming in. When we measure our volume, so whenever we're trying to breathe, it's ideal for us to know, are we breathing enough, or what should we be breathing compared to everyone else? There are different volumes that we like to consider, and I'll show you a picture of this in just a moment here. First off, we have what's called your tidal volume, and that's the fluctuation of volume of you breathing in normally. So while you're sitting here, standing here, watching this, however you're doing this, you're breathing in, you're breathing out as normal. This is your tidal volume. It goes up, it goes down. If I asked you to suck in as much air as you possibly could, that means you're flexing that diaphragm, all this air is moving into your lungs. You breathe in, your chest puffs out. This is your inspiratory reserve volume. This is the excess amount of oxygen slash air that you can put into your lungs. And I should say air, not oxygen, because there are other types of gases that if it's in your atmosphere, you're breathing those in instead. If, however, we come back to normal and I ask you to breathe out as much as you can, even though I'm breathing normally, I can still breathe out. And it's hard to stay like this for a while. Your body makes you breathe really quickly again. This is your expiratory reserve volume. This is how much air you can breathe out beyond your tidal volume. So there's a little bit of excess you can breathe in, a little bit of excess you can breathe out. And if you're not playing with those two, you always have your tidal volume that you're breathing in and out. If we add all of these numbers together, we get what's called your vital capacity. And this is the amount of air, the volume of air that you have control over in your lungs. So if you retake control from your brain and you want to manipulate, you're about to swim, you want to hold your breath to get a little bit excess air underwater, well, you're going to play with that inspiratory reserve volume a bit. If you want to blow all of your air out to make yourself nice and thin to fit through a little gap if you need to do so, you can do this through your expiratory reserve volume. Those are all possibilities. This is added up to your vital capacity. Your vital capacity is not your total lung capacity, though, because no matter what you manipulate, you always have some residual volume that is always in your lungs. It should always be there, just sitting at the bottom. It gives your respiratory system some structure. It gives it that minimal pressure to keep it held up tight. Otherwise, everything collapses on itself. So you must have the residual volume there. However, if you add both your residual and your vital capacity together, that is your total lung volume. And here's an image of a spirograph, which we can use to visualize these various different types of breathing. So this sine curve right across this middle section here between 2,400 and 2,900 milliliters is your tidal volume. When I ask you to breathe in, that number increases significantly. That's your inspiratory reserve. When I ask you to breathe out, this is your expiratory reserve volume. When a person is hyperventilating, so let's say a swimmer before they're going for a long swim, they will alternate between inspiratory and expiratory reserve volume back and forth. That's going to allow their lungs to stretch out a little bit, stretch out their diaphragm, and that gives them a little bit of excess oxygen to function underwater for longer. You shouldn't do this for too long, though, because when you hyperventilate, you can cause yourself to pass out because of the pulses of oxygen. Ideally, you should be working with your tidal volume if possible. If we take all of these numbers, wherever this green bar or this green line graph is touching, we have what's called your vital capacity. If we combine your vital capacity with that residual volume at the bottom, we have what's called your total lung volume. Okay, so a little bit of information there. This is called a spirograph, as mentioned. We're using a spirometer. We can blow into a spirometer to get this measurement. If we don't have this measurement, we might have to draw it ourselves. But typically, most spirometers, they can be connected to a computer, and then you can just get that generated for you. So it's just a dial that you breathe into the tube as normal, and it generates the graph for you so that you can read how your breathing is functioning. And that brings us into the actual human respiratory system, where I want to explain the parts and the illnesses. I'm going to pause here, though. Doing so, that just separates our notes a little bit here. So let's give it a pause here, and then in our next section, I'll tell you about the actual respiratory system, the parts, and a couple of disorders as well. But for the time being, let's pause here, and I'll see you in a little bit.